For a long time, I believed loneliness meant having nobody physically around me. I thought loneliness looked like empty rooms, silent phones, and weekends without invitations. But eventually I realized something uncomfortable and surprisingly common among many adults today. You can feel deeply lonely, even while sharing your space with people who care about you. That realization didn't arrive suddenly or dramatically, but quietly, through repeated emotional patterns. If you grew up feeling emotionally unseen, this type of loneliness might feel strangely familiar. Not abandoned, not rejected, just subtly unsupported in moments where warmth was needed. Maybe affection existed, but it never quite arrived in the way your nervous system expected. Maybe hugs were rare, emotions weren't discussed, or vulnerability felt inconvenient to others. This doesn't mean your caregivers were cruel, negligent, or intentionally harmful. Parenting is one of the hardest human roles, often performed by emotionally wounded people themselves. Most parents do their best using the tools they were given, not the tools required. The problem isn't always how much love was offered, but how much was needed. Some children require more emotional attunement than others, especially highly sensitive ones. When that attunement doesn't happen, something subtle forms inside the child's emotional structure. They learn to survive without fully feeling, or feel without knowing how to express it. As adults, these children often appear independent, functional, even successful from the outside. Inside, however, there's a quiet sense of emotional disconnection that never fully disappears. This is the loneliness that follows you into relationships, friendships, and even family life. You can be surrounded by people and still feel emotionally untouched. That experience creates confusion because nothing seems obviously wrong on the surface. You start wondering whether the problem is you, your expectations, or your emotional wiring. Many people respond by trying harder to connect, please, or attach. Others respond by withdrawing, assuming closeness will inevitably lead to disappointment. Neither strategy actually resolves the core issue, because the issue isn't external, it's internal, rooted in an early emotional learning that shaped how connection feels. This video isn't about blaming parents or revisiting childhood with resentment. It's about understanding how early emotional absence can quietly shape adult loneliness. Once you understand that pattern, something important changes. Loneliness stops feeling like a personal failure and starts looking like a learned response. And learned responses, unlike fate, can be unlearned. When emotional needs weren't consistently met, the child adapts rather than collapses. That adaptation becomes personality, behavior, and relationship strategy later in life. One common adaptation is idealizing emotional relationships beyond realistic human limits. Love becomes imagined as something that will finally heal everything that once felt missing. Friendships carry similar emotional weight, often without either person realizing it. The problem with idealization is simple and unavoidable. Humans eventually disappoint. When expectations are unrealistic, disappointment feels catastrophic rather than manageable. That disappointment often triggers withdrawal, resentment, or sudden emotional shutdown. Another frequent pattern is deep mistrust toward others, especially emotional closeness. If primary caregivers couldn't meet emotional needs, later connections feel unreliable by default. The unconscious logic is brutal but consistent. If they couldn't love me properly, who will? This belief doesn't stay theoretical. It shows up as jealousy, control, or emotional guarding. Even friendships can feel threatening when emotional security is fragile. Another adaptation is hypersensitivity to perceived rejection or emotional distance. A delayed message, a distracted response, or a canceled plan can feel devastating. The emotional reaction feels disproportional, but the nervous system disagrees. It reacts as if abandonment is happening again, right now, in the present moment. At the same time, there's often difficulty recognizing other people's emotional needs. When you're constantly scanning for emotional safety, empathy becomes harder to access. You're not selfish, you're overwhelmed by your own unmet emotional signals. This combination creates a painful loop, craving closeness, then sabotaging it unconsciously. Some people preemptively end relationships to avoid slow emotional disappointment. Others tolerate mistreatment because loneliness feels worse than emotional discomfort. Both strategies are attempts to regain control over emotional uncertainty. Unfortunately, they usually deepen the very loneliness they aim to prevent. This isn't weakness, and it's not immaturity. It's a nervous system trained to survive emotional unpredictability. The key problem is not lack of love from others today. It's the belief that love must compensate for something missing inside. No partner, friend, or family member can heal that gap permanently. Expecting them to creates pressure, imbalance, and eventual disappointment. Real healing begins when responsibility gently shifts inward, without shame or self-blame. One of the most confusing emotional traps is realizing that craving love can increase loneliness. This happens when love stops being connection and starts becoming emotional compensation. Instead of sharing presence, you unconsciously ask relationships to repair something unfinished. That invisible request changes how others experience being close to you. People sense pressure even when you never articulate expectations out loud. Love becomes heavier, not warmer, because it carries unresolved emotional weight. Another common behavior is emotional over-adaptation, disguised as kindness or generosity. You anticipate needs, suppress preferences, and prioritize harmony over authenticity. At first, this seems to keep relationships stable and conflict-free. Over time, it creates quiet resentment and emotional exhaustion. You start feeling unseen while actively hiding parts of yourself. That contradiction slowly erodes intimacy from the inside. Another subtle habit is monitoring others' moods to regulate your own safety. You become hyper-aware of tone changes, delays, or emotional distance. This constant scanning keeps your nervous system in a low-level threat response. Connection becomes vigilance, not rest. Some people cope by becoming emotionally impressive rather than emotionally present. They offer advice, competence, reliability, and strength instead of vulnerability. Being needed feels safer than being known. Unfortunately, admiration cannot replace emotional attunement. Others respond by avoiding dependency entirely, calling it independence. They pride themselves on not needing anyone while quietly longing for closeness. This strategy prevents disappointment, but also blocks emotional nourishment. Another destructive pattern is confusing intensity with intimacy. Emotional highs and lows feel meaningful because they mimic early emotional chaos. Calm relationships feel unfamiliar, sometimes even threatening. Your nervous system mistakes predictability for boredom. This is conditioning, not preference. Another overlooked habit is outsourcing emotional regulation to partners or friends. You expect reassurance to arrive externally before calm becomes possible. When it doesn't, anxiety escalates and resentment silently grows. Healthy relationships involve shared regulation, not emotional dependency. Learning self-regulation doesn't reduce closeness, it stabilizes it. When you stop using love as emotional rescue, connection becomes lighter. Relationships stop feeling like survival mechanisms and start feeling optional but meaningful. Loneliness decreases not because others change, but because expectations become realistic. You no longer seek completion through people who were never meant to complete you. Loneliness does not only shape how you relate to people, it quietly shapes how you live your days, how you make decisions, and what you allow yourself to want. This is one of the least discussed consequences of early emotional absence, because it doesn't look dramatic. It looks practical, responsible, reasonable. Yet over time, it creates a life that feels strangely narrow. When emotional safety was missing early on, the nervous system learns to prioritize predictability over fulfillment. You don't choose what excites you. You choose what feels least risky. Not because you lack ambition, but because risk once came with emotional cost. Many emotionally lonely adults notice this pattern in their work life. They gravitate toward roles that feel stable, contained, and emotionally distant. Jobs that don't ask too much of them, but also don't give much back. The absence of conflict feels like relief, yet the absence of meaning slowly drains energy. You may tell yourself you're being realistic, grateful, or disciplined, but beneath that story is often a quiet fear of wanting too much and being disappointed again. The same pattern appears in routines. You repeat days that feel manageable rather than nourishing. You stick to familiar habits, familiar environments, familiar conversations, not because they fulfill you, but because they don't destabilize you. Over time, this creates a subtle emotional flatness. Life becomes organized, functional, and emotionally muted. Nothing is wrong, yet nothing feels fully right. This is loneliness expressed through structure rather than isolation. Another place this shows up is decision-making. Simple choices feel surprisingly exhausting. What do you want to eat, do, pursue, or change? Instead of accessing preference, your mind scans consequences. Will this create conflict? Will this disappoint someone? Will this demand emotional exposure? When preference was never mirrored or validated early on, it doesn't develop clarity. Desire feels vague, unsafe, or negotiable. You hesitate not because you don't care, but because caring once felt costly. Over time, you may start outsourcing decisions to circumstances or other people. Letting life decide feels easier than choosing. This creates a sense of passivity that often gets misinterpreted as laziness or lack of direction. In reality, it's emotional caution shaped by early learning. Another subtle effect appears in ambition. You may downplay your goals, soften your dreams, or avoid articulating them altogether. Not because you lack them, but because wanting openly feels vulnerable. Ambition exposes hope, and hope once led to disappointment. So you keep goals abstract, delayed, or conditional. You tell yourself, maybe later, often enough that later never arrives. This is not a lack of drive. It's a protective adaptation against emotional letdown. Even pleasure can become complicated. Many emotionally lonely people struggle to fully enjoy good moments. When something positive happens, part of the mind waits for it to end. Joy feels temporary, fragile, or undeserved. Instead of settling into pleasure, you monitor it. You anticipate loss before it occurs. This prevents emotional saturation, which once felt unsafe. As a result, happiness never quite lands. It passes through without staying. Another overlooked area is rest. True rest requires safety. If your nervous system learned to stay alert emotionally, rest feels unfamiliar. You might stay busy, stimulated, or mentally occupied even during downtime. Silence feels uncomfortable. Stillness invites feelings you learn to suppress. So you fill space with noise, tasks, or distractions. Loneliness hides behind productivity and efficiency. From the outside, you appear functional. Inside, you rarely feel fully restored. What makes these patterns difficult to recognize is that they often receive social validation. Being responsible, independent, low maintenance, and adaptable is praised. No one questions the cost. Yet the cost accumulates slowly. You start feeling disconnected from your own life, not because it's empty, but because it was built around emotional survival rather than emotional truth. Healing at this level doesn't begin with drastic changes. It begins with noticing where you consistently choose safety over sincerity, where you minimize desire before it fully forms, where you default to what is acceptable instead of what is alive. These are not character flaws. They are learned strategies that once made sense. Loneliness loses power when these patterns become visible, not judged, not rushed, just seen clearly. Because once you recognize how loneliness shaped your daily choices, you can begin making new ones. Not louder choices, not riskier ones, but truer ones. And over time, those choices quietly rebuild a life that feels less managed and more inhabited. Being loved and feeling loved are not the same experience. Many adults understand this intellectually, but never emotionally. They can name the people who care, remember gestures of affection, and still feel untouched inside. Love reaches them, but it doesn't stay. Compliments feel temporary, reassurance feels incomplete, and closeness feels strangely unstable. This creates confusion because nothing appears wrong on the surface. You start wondering why love never feels like enough, or why it fades so quickly once it arrives. The problem is not that others fail to love you. The problem is that your nervous system never learned how to receive love as something safe and lasting. When early affection was inconsistent, conditional, or emotionally muted, the body adapted by staying alert. Love became something to monitor rather than something to rest inside. As an adult, this adaptation doesn't disappear. It quietly shapes how you experience connection, intimacy, and emotional security. When someone gets close, part of you braces. When someone reassures you, part of you waits for the withdrawal. You don't relax into connection because your system expects it to disappear. This is why reassurance rarely works long term. It calms you briefly, then the unease returns. Love feels like something you must secure repeatedly instead of something you can trust. Over time, this creates emotional fatigue, not only for you, but for the people around you. Partners and friends sense the invisible pressure even when you never express it out loud. They feel responsible for maintaining your sense of safety without knowing why. That imbalance slowly erodes closeness and turns connection into emotional labor. Another quiet shift happens when loneliness begins to heal, and this part is rarely described honestly. Healing does not feel like sudden happiness or emotional relief. It often feels like emotional quiet, the absence of constant scanning, the absence of urgency, the absence of internal negotiation around closeness. At first, this quiet can feel unsettling. If your nervous system learned intimacy through emotional intensity, calm feels unfamiliar. You may even interpret stability as boredom or emotional distance. This doesn't mean something is missing. It means your system is recalibrating. You are no longer confusing intensity with intimacy. You begin noticing that love expressed consistently feels different from love expressed dramatically. Reliability replaces urgency. Presence replaces performance. You no longer feel the need to earn closeness or manage others' emotions to stay connected. Another important change shows up in how disappointment is experienced. When loneliness dominated, disappointment felt catastrophic. A delayed reply, a canceled plan, or emotional distance triggered deep internal reactions. As healing progresses, disappointment becomes tolerable, not pleasant, but survivable. You stop interpreting every rupture as proof of abandonment. This creates emotional resilience that doesn't rely on control or withdrawal. Relationships become less fragile because they no longer carry the weight of repairing old wounds. You also start noticing a shift in self-worth. Love stops being evidence of value and becomes a shared experience instead. When affection fluctuates, your sense of self remains intact. You don't collapse inward or question your worth automatically. This alone reduces loneliness dramatically, not because others change, but because your internal foundation stabilizes. Another subtle sign of healing is the ability to enjoy closeness without anticipating loss. Moments of connection stop feeling temporary. You allow yourself to stay present without bracing for the ending. This doesn't make you naive, it makes you grounded. You trust that even if something ends, you will remain emotionally intact. Loneliness loses its grip when emotional safety becomes internal rather than conditional. You no longer need relationships to rescue you from emptiness. They become places of exchange, not repair. This doesn't mean loneliness disappears entirely. It softens. It becomes an occasional feeling rather than a defining identity. You may still feel alone sometimes, but it no longer feels personal or permanent. It becomes a signal, not a verdict. And for the first time, being with others feels genuinely less lonely than being alone, because you are no longer absent from yourself. Connection stops feeling like something you must secure. It starts feeling like something you can receive. Calm replaces vigilance. Presence replaces performance. And slowly, quietly, loneliness releases its hold. Loneliness is often misunderstood as a temporary emotional state caused by external circumstances. In reality, It can slowly transform into an identity built around early emotional deprivation. When love was inconsistent or insufficient, loneliness stopped being situational and became familiar. The nervous system adapted by treating emotional distance as normal and closeness as unpredictable. Over time, this internalized loneliness stops asking to be resolved. It simply becomes the background noise of everyday life. Many people stop noticing it because it doesn't hurt sharply anymore. It feels dull, constant, and oddly predictable. This is why some individuals feel lonely even inside stable relationships. Their partners are present, but the emotional imprint of absence remains active. Loneliness, in this case, is not about lacking people. It is about lacking internalized safety around love. When early affection was inconsistent, the mind learned to stay alert. You expect love to disappear, so you never fully settle into it. This creates a subtle emotional distance, even during intimacy. You might share space, routines, and conversations, yet still feel unseen. Loneliness becomes a silent marker of unmet emotional needs, not current reality. Another consequence is emotional self-containment. You stop reaching out because you learned that needs were inconvenient. You become independent too early, strong too soon, self-sufficient by necessity. Others admire your resilience, unaware it was forged through emotional scarcity. That strength, however, often blocks receiving care later in life. You don't ask, not because you don't need, but because you don't trust. Loneliness persists because connection feels unreliable at a core level. Even love feels temporary, conditional, or fragile. This creates an internal contradiction, craving closeness while preparing for its loss. As a result, relationships feel emotionally taxing instead of nourishing. You are present but guarded, available but braced. Loneliness becomes the price of emotional self-protection. Understanding this shifts the narrative from personal failure to adaptive survival. Loneliness is not a flaw. It is evidence of a system that learned to cope without consistent love. When emotional deprivation is unresolved, it shapes how love is interpreted in adulthood. Affection may feel overwhelming, suspicious, or insufficient, regardless of its sincerity. Compliments feel temporary, reassurance feels incomplete, and closeness feels unstable. This leads to subtle behavioral patterns that reinforce loneliness. One pattern is emotional hyper-responsibility. You take charge of others' emotions to maintain relational stability. Another pattern is emotional withdrawal during moments of vulnerability. You share thoughts, but withhold feelings. You explain experiences intellectually instead of expressing them emotionally. This creates conversations without connection. Another consequence is overinterpretation of emotional signals. Delays, silences, or shifts in tone feel loaded with meaning. Your mind fills gaps with familiar narratives of neglect or rejection. This constant interpretation keeps the nervous system in mild distress. Loneliness thrives in this state of emotional vigilance. Another overlooked aspect is how deprivation affects self-worth. Love becomes proof of value rather than shared experience. When affection fades temporarily, self-doubt immediately follows. You don't just miss the person, you question your own worth. This internal dynamic makes relationships emotionally heavy for both sides. Partners sense pressure without understanding its origin. They feel responsible for emotional regulation they didn't agree to provide. Over time, this imbalance creates distance, confirming your deepest fear. Loneliness is reinforced, not because love failed, but because expectations were misaligned. Healing begins when loneliness is recognized as an internal signal, not a verdict. It points toward unmet emotional learning, not permanent damage. Learning to experience love without scanning for loss is a skill. Trusting emotional consistency takes time, repetition, and conscious effort. This process doesn't erase loneliness immediately, it softens it. Gradually, love stops feeling like something you must secure. It becomes something you can receive without bracing. Loneliness loses its authority when emotional safety becomes internal. You stop measuring love by intensity and start recognizing it by reliability. Connection feels quieter, steadier, and less dramatic. And for the first time, being with others feels less lonely than being alone. If you want, leave a comment and say when you first realized you could feel lonely, even while being loved. It can be a moment, a memory, or just a sentence. Just your experience. And if this kind of calm, honest breakdown helps you understand yourself a little better, consider subscribing to the channel. More videos like this are coming. Cheers.